Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's morning meditation. We are in the 27th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. And beginning in verse 45, and we'll read down to verse 50, we are at the focal point of all of the scriptures when Jesus is upon the cross. It reads, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of them that stood there, when they heard that, said, This man calleth for Elias or Elijah. And straightway one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on a reed and gave him to drink. The rest said, Let be, let us see whether Elias will come to save him. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost." As I was reading these verses and thinking about them, there is two things that I wanted to look at more closely. One of them is verse 50. It says, when Jesus yelled again. And I was thinking, what did he yell? Obviously, we wouldn't know unless the scriptures tell us that. And thank God they do. And we find that in the Gospel of John. So this is something that he says right after someone gives him some vinegar and he's able to take a drink of it. So if we go into the Gospel of John, we see when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, It is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. So we know in Matthew's gospel, it doesn't particularly say it, but what Jesus says in verse 50 is, it is finished. So now we have two statements in these 5 verses of Jesus upon the cross for us to look at, and they're kind of bookend statements. Jesus is upon the cross. He is paying for the sin of all mankind. That's the reason he came, to become that substitutionary sacrifice. And when he is paying for the sin of all the world, the sin of every person ever born, your sin and my sin, he becomes sin and God judges him. And it's that point where he's screaming out or crying out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Jesus, who was always with the Father, who had never been separated from God, that is part of the Trinity, who is God, in that instance becoming sin and receiving the judgment of God, for the first time feels separation from God. Not only is he separated from God, but he's also then has poured out upon him all of God's wrath for all the sin that was ever committed. God's judgment for every murder, God's judgment for every rape, God's judgment for every child that has been molested, God's judgment for every lie. Could you think about the terror of that judgment falling upon Jesus there on the cross? The people didn't understand what was going on. They thought he was crying for Elijah. Many people today look at the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and they don't understand what's going on either. They think that he was a good man or a prophet or a crazy man, but few understand what he purchased for us and what's available to all men because of his suffering, because he became the sacrificial Lamb of God. The people are still waiting to see whether Elijah will come. They're looking at this like some kind of a TV show. And Jesus, after he receives the vinegar, cries out with a loud voice, and this time he says something very different. He says, It is finished. Another way that people will translate those words is paid in full. And we see Jesus entering into the suffering, the full judgment of God in verse 46. And in verse 50, coming out on the other side, and now says that the bill for all the sin ever committed has been paid in full. He took it upon himself, and he paid the bill. That's why we do not do works to be saved. We can't add anything to a bill once it's already been paid. Jesus paid it completely there on the cross. We don't have to do a thing to add to it. In fact, if we say that we must add something to his sacrifice, I believe that we're insulting God. If we say that his work on the cross wasn't quite good enough, I need to just add a little bit more to make it acceptable. We diminish his sacrifice, and we don't understand at all the enormity of the transaction that took place on the cross. We're saved by grace, unmerited favor of God, which we obtain by faith in Jesus Christ, and nothing more, nothing added to it. Good works will come in the life of a Christian, not so that we can be saved, but as an evidence of our salvation, because we've been made new and made like God in terms of having the Spirit of God inside of us, being conformed unto the image of Jesus Christ. We will begin to do those things like God would do. And since God is kind and loving and giving and does good works, we who are his children should be kind and loving and giving and do good works, not to be saved, but as an evidence of our salvation. It was paid in full for us. He was broken for us. So how do we respond to such a sacrifice? How do we respond to such love? Paul says it perfectly in Romans, in the 12th chapter. Present yourself as a living sacrifice each day unto the Lord. I'm paraphrasing, each day unto the Lord, which is your reasonable service. Considering everything that God has done for us, since he held nothing back and gave us his best, he gave it all, then in return, we should give ourselves wholly to him. We will not suffer like he suffered. We will not suffer because he suffered. In that same way, being forsaken by God. We owe him everything. And his love should compel us to desire him and his ways above all things. If you are still holding back parts of yourself, if you're still putting your agenda before his, dwell on these verses for a while. You may see your priorities diminish in the light of his magnificent sacrifice. Lord, I pray that each one of us would understand the height and the breadth and the depth of your love for us, and in so doing, all fear would be cast out from us, and we would then pursue loving you and serving you with complete abandon, and giving you and you alone the glory. Have a great day, guys. Bye.